Well, I just want to say a very heartfelt thank you for the privilege of being here. And it really is a privilege to be able to share the pain, the passion, and the privilege of supporting our brothers and sisters who are holding front lines of faith and freedom for us. Can you hear me? Well, if you can't and you still want to, let me know. If you want to go to sleep, I shall fully understand. But just before we go on our travels to be with our brothers and sisters, I want to introduce myself very briefly, in case you wonder why someone with strange title of Baroness is here tonight. All I ever say about myself is I'm actually a nurse and a social scientist by intention and a Baroness by astonishment. I was not into politics. I was the first Baroness I'd ever met. I didn't move in those circles. You wake up one morning and find a Baroness looking at herself out of the bathroom mirror. Quite a shock. But what a privilege. Daunting. But I asked God how I'd use the privilege of being able to speak in the House of Lords. And the idea came very clearly. It's a wonderful place to be a voice for people whose voices are not heard. So I set up our small NGO HEART, Humanitarian Aid Relief Trust, and David has worked with me for quite a few years, for a long number of years. David was a chaplain in the Royal Navy, the Royal Marines for 20 years. And we work for people suffering persecution and oppression on those front lines of faith and freedom who are not reached by other organizations for security reasons, because they're usually in war zones, or political reasons, because if a regime is persecuting a minority in its own borders and doesn't give permission to big boys like the UN, then they can't go. So we spend quite a lot of our time crossing borders illegally, completely shamelessly, to be with our partners. And we work with local partners, and they are real heroes and heroines. And what I love tonight is an opportunity I'd like to get out of the way and introduce you to our brothers and sisters on those front lines of faith and freedom. But very briefly, I trained as a nurse at the London Hospital, and I'm 85, so you can work out how many years ago I would have been a student nurse. And at that time, the London Hospital had an annex out here in Brentwood. And I did some of my first year student nurses night duty at the annex in Brentwood, where I met my, now late, but became my husband. He was a junior medical officer there. But I was asked to tell one story about being a student nurse. There are quite a few of them. But this is just one little story, and then we'll get serious. But I'm afraid sometimes I can be a bit cheeky. And we had a very formidable head of the preliminary training school, and everyone was terrified of her. And one morning, it was residential preliminary training school, and she addressed us all at breakfast, and she said, they only call you student nurses until you're qualified. Student nurses. She said, today we're having a visit from the matron of St. Thomas's Hospital. Now there was tremendous competition between the London Hospital and St. Thomas's. St. Thomas's thought it was the greatest and the best, and Florence Nightingale and everything else. But the London, actually, we thought we were quite a good hospital too. Very good at sending missionaries abroad. And the matron of St. Thomas's was coming. And she said, I want you to be really tidy. Go and sharpen up your shoes and starch your caps. And you're to come and be in your best behavior. So we all arrived in the practice room with our starched caps and shiny shoes. And the matron of St. Thomas's was there. And Miss Daly was there. And everyone was quiet. And then she said to two student nurses, will you go and put Mrs. Brown, who was the model we used to work with, into an appropriate position, post-operative care for cholecystectomy. So everyone was sitting silent, and they started moving Mrs. Brown, and suddenly the silence was rendered by, Mommy! They moved her again, and we heard, Mommy! Oh, my gosh. 2 days ago, for fun, I thought that I'd make Mrs. Brown pregnant, so that one day when they were doing a care on Mrs. Brown, and they did her stomach so they could take off a leg or an arm, they'd find she was pregnant. So I put a doll in there, and I hadn't realized it was a talking doll. So with the matron of St. Thomas's there, and always meant to be absolutely the best student nurse you could ever have, Miss Daly, I had to go and do a cesarean operation and remove that blasted speaking doll. I thought that was the end of my nursing training. Well, I was allowed to complete it. But anyway, being a nurse is a wonderful way of being able to be with our brothers and sisters on the front lines of faith and freedom. So I'm going to invite you to work with HEART and just meet some of our wonderful partners. Now, HEART, Humanitarian Aid Relief Trust, provides aid and advocacy for people suffering oppression and persecution, largely neglected by the major international organizations for reasons which I have mentioned. But we do work with local partners, and they are the real heroes and heroines, as you will see. The first place we're going to visit is Armenia. Armenia, you may know, was the first nation to become Christian in 301. Gregory wanted to bring Christianity to Armenia, and the king didn't want this, and he flung Gregory into a dungeon, which is still there. You see at the left-hand side of that building, there's a kind of circular wall. Well, that is the wall of the dungeon. It's about 30 foot deep, still there, and we've been down it many, many times. But poor Gregory was flung down to the bottom of that dungeon. He's meant to die, but the king's sister took a shine to Gregory, and every night she put food and water down there, and poor Gregory survived 13 long years at the bottom of that hellhole of a dungeon. Sometimes I think he must have felt a little bit like St. Teresa, who apparently once said to our Lord, "Oh Lord, it's not surprising you've got so few friends the way you treat them." But anyway, after 13 years, the king became mortally ill, asked his people who could save him, and they said the guy at the bottom of the dungeon, Your Majesty. So Gregory was hauled up out of that dungeon. He still kept his values. Before he attended to the king, he looked after girls whom the king had been abusing. Then he turned to the king, healed the king. The king became a Christian, and Armenia became the first Christian nation in the world in 301. Got many of the oldest churches in the world in that land. This is a poignant picture in many ways, because in the background you can see Mount Ararat, which is Armenia's national symbol. But in the Turkish genocide of 1915, when 1.5 million Armenians were slaughtered by Turkey, Turkey took all of what was then Western Armenia, is now Eastern Turkey, including Mount Ararat. So Armenia's national symbol is trapped behind Turkish borders. Well, as I've just said quite a lot about this. Armenia was the first nation to become Christian in 301. Gregory brought Christian to Armenia. I didn't realize I'd done this for typing. I'm more efficient than I thought I was. Anyway, so it's there written. And as I said, he had similar thoughts to those of St. Teresa of Avila, who regularly approached our Lord saying, "Oh Lord, it's not surprising you have so few friends the way you treat them." We often wonder about that. When we are with our brothers and sisters suffering persecution, they worship with such joy. Makes me feel very, very humble. And then after 13 years, the king came mortally ill, said who could save him? They said the man at the bottom of the dungeon. Gregory was hauled out, saved the king. The king became a Christian. Armenia became the first Christian nation. But it has suffered so much over the centuries. The first major genocide of the last century, when 1.5 million Armenians were murdered by Turkey. And Nagorno Karabakh is a little bit of ancient Armenia that Stalin, in his sort of divide and rule tactics, took away from Armenia and placed inside Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan has attempted to get rid of the Armenians out of that little land, but it's got some 4th century churches, and it's no denying it is historically Armenia. And then there was a bitter, bitter war in the early 1990s when Azerbaijan really unleashed all its military forces. I was there many times in that war. That's where, in case you don't really visualize, that's the little land on Nagorno Karabakh. You see where it is, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and so on. Well, this was during that war. I used to count 400 Grad missiles a day, pounding in on the little capital city, Stepanakert, totally civilian targets, war crimes. And then this poignant picture, I took all these pictures. These two guys are sitting on the rubble of what had been one in the blue jeans, his home, and under that pile of rubble are his wife and 2 little girls. It really was most high-intensity conflict of the early 1990s. But so often new life, hope and healing for the hopeless, beauty from the ashes of destruction. We will always ask in HEART our local partners to identify their priorities. We don't tell them what we're going to do, we say, what's your priority? And the Armenians said, please help for people with disabilities. The Soviet Union had no care for people with disabilities. I did a lot of work in the Soviet Union when it was Soviet. And if you had a disability, you were just marginalized, left out of sight, you didn't upset people. And the Armenians wanted better. They gave us a bombed-out old building. There weren't any buildings that were not bombed out in Stepanakert. This was it. And our wonderful partner there, Vardan, is the guy in the red jeans you can see there, and his team have turned it into an internationally recognized center of excellence. And recently, the director of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Karabakh visited, and she was blown away. She claimed it was 40 years ahead of any rehabilitation center she'd seen in any of the many countries where she had worked. It really is a place of hope and healing for little kids with autism, spina bifida, people with road accidents, sadly with the recent war, over 200 soldiers with injuries, and elderly people with strokes. But in the autumn of 2020, Azerbaijan unleashed a new war on Karabakh, supported by Turkey, with massive military resources, including attacking buildings such as hospitals, which is a war crime, illegal use of cluster bombs, and targeting civilians with drones. I was there many times in that war. This was the maternity hospital, deliberately targeted. There's David and Vardan, the head of the rehab center, myself, in Stepanakert, standing in front of the remains of the electric power station that was deliberately targeted, so there was no electricity, no light, nor heat for the people. And there have been harrowing cases where Azerbaijani soldiers have captured Armenians, taken their phones, and taken videos of them torturing and executing a prisoner, Armenian prisoner, then sending the photos of that torture and that murder back to their families. And last time I was there, I was hugging an Armenian lady who'd lost her husband, and she said she just didn't dare to look at her phone in case it had on it what had happened to her husband. Well, and Azerbaijan continues up to this very day, while we are sitting here, to commit crimes against humanity with complete impunity, continues the detention of Armenian prisoners. In the ceasefire in 2020, both sides agreed to release prisoners. Armenia released all the Azerbaijani prisoners, but Azerbaijan still holds a lot of Armenian prisoners. And the violation of the ceasefire agreement and destruction of those precious sacred sites. And currently, right now, Azerbaijan is perpetrating another potential genocide. It's blocking the only road between Armenia and Nagorno Karabakh through which supplies come since December the 12th. So the provision of food, medicines, can't get through, and cutting off power, and it's colder there than it is here in the winter. And I'm sorry to say, the international community has not intervened. The British government, I've written to them, been raised in Parliament, is doing nothing to help get the supplies through to the Armenians in that little land. So prayers needed, please. We're off now, seatbelts on, no jet lag, off to Burma. We call it Burma, not Myanmar, because the local people prefer that. The dreadful suffering of the Rohingya people, I think, has been widely reported and is generally known. But the suffering of other groups, such as the Shan people and the Chin, is not publicized, and much of the aid for them has been transferred to the Rohingya, making their suffering even greater. And we have the privilege of working with the Shan and the Chin peoples. Here we are crossing over from Thailand into Burma illegally. You can't help they're being exhilarated by the beauty, but it's fairly fearful. Because inside, when the villages are attacked by the Burmese military, they use military offensives. And of course, the buildings are all made of wood in the jungle, and they just go up in smoke like that. David, I think, is either getting bored or going to see if he can hear me at the back. Sometimes he tests the hearing. Is that what you're doing? Yes, it is. Oh, good. Oh, that's a good idea. Yes, might you put the main lighting down? And that good thinking, young man. I'm 85, he's only 72. He's a youngster. Thank you very much. But out there, hundreds of thousands have been driven from their homes to take, where do they go? This phrase came to me, there's nowhere to go. The long road to nowhere. All they can do is become internally displaced peoples or flee into exile in overcrowded refugee camps. It's hell on earth out there. And this is a picture I took of people on that long road to nowhere. We never hear about this on the news, do we? But it is horrendous. And kids drawing sad, or this little kid, look at his land, that is his life. Destroyed trees, but I'm very sad. But a light in the darkness again. Sasa was a wonderful friend of mine from the Chin Hill tribes, northwest Burma, qualified as doctor about 15 years ago and returned to his people. I may just say it's quite difficult to qualify as a doctor from the very remote areas in Chin State and other remote areas. They're not allowed secondary schools because the regime doesn't want them to be educated. So he was sent to Rangoon for secondary school and had to learn Burmese, and he spoke his native language, lived in abject poverty between a cow and a stinking toilet, came out head of the school, went to India for his pre-clinicals, had to work all the time to make money for his medical training. Heard there was a country called Armenia where he could study medicine cheaper than Britain or America. So I met Sasa studying medicine in Armenia with his fifth language, fifth script, and having to work all the time when he was studying. He is a real hero. But his vision was to train community health workers to provide life-saving health care for villages deep inside Chin State where there was no health care at all. He graduated in June about 15 years ago. He immediately returned to his people. They cleared the dense jungle, they built a training center, and this is in remote areas, stuff in the mountains, and sent messengers to over 150 villages, inviting each village to elect a guy and a girl to come to be trained as community health workers. And they had to walk through the jungle. There are no roads there. Walk 5-7 days to the villages. By November, everything was ready. 317 students had arrived from 153 villages to begin their training to become CHWs. And as I've said, they often had to walk 5-7 days through the jungle, no roads, to attend. We were there for the opening. Here is the opening. You can see David sitting there, looking a bit younger than he does now, and myself too, but what a privilege to be there. And, sorry, they had to have the textbooks sent up from Rangoon, and you can imagine carrying textbooks, 3 for each student, over the mountains, through the jungle, across the rivers, but they did it. And by November, everything was ready, and that's the opening, the textbooks, and there's a lovely picture of Dr. Sasa. Sorry, Simon, I'm technologically challenged at my age. We've done that one? Yeah. Oh, there's a picture of Sasa, and that's a map of Chin State and just getting down to Rakhine State, and every dot, white dot on there, is a village where their health workers are saving the lives of 8 out of 10 people who would previously have died. Anything that's treatable, they treat. And the main killers, unless you know how to treat them, are things like diarrhea, septicemia from a cut finger, malaria, but they can be treated and prevented. And so people die of old age in remote areas, of course, or cancer, but they save the lives of 8 out of 10 people, for 250,000 people now. And with Help well established, Sasa responded to pressure to enter politics just 2 years ago. It's well and truly established. They trained 1,000 community health workers, reaching 250,000 people. And he's very popular in Burma, and they were asking him to go into politics. So he did actually leave the Health and Hope program in very good hands and flourishing, and he went into the politics. And almost immediately there was a military regime unleashed offences against the recently democratically elected government, killed and imprisoned elected members of parliament, and others had to flee into hiding, and they still are in prison and in hiding. Sasa just escaped and was chosen by the elected government to be their international representative. He's been designated a traitor by the military regime and is in constant danger of assassination. Apparently there's a price on his head going up into the thousands of dollars, so he's in constant danger. But he is an inspirationally competent spokesperson for justice and truth. But please do pray for his safety and the safety of his family, because they really are living life-threatening situations. Okay, seatbelts on again, no jet lag. Off to South Sudan. I've had the privilege of working there many times. I worked as a nurse in remote area desert work in Sudan way back in my many years ago. But it's really remote area stuff. But South Sudan suffered a war inflicted by the Islamists. Make a distinction between Islam and Islamism. Islam is just, Islam. Lovely, delightful, moderate, likable people, Muslims. Islamism is the ideology of those behind ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and those perpetrating atrocities in many parts of the world today. So you see the word Islamist up there. South Sudan suffered a war inflicted by the Islamist regime in Khartoum from 1989 to 2005, in which 2 million people died, 4 million were displaced, and tens of thousands of women and children abducted into slavery. It was hell on earth. And I went there. We went to rescue slaves. We went there when the slave raids were going on. This is just one picture. I'm afraid I could show you many like it. But we were expecting the attack to come to the village where we were staying, and I thought I probably wouldn't survive that night. But they eventually, for some reason, went to the neighboring village, and the casualties started coming in the morning. This guy, as you will see, was shot in the face. I mean, horrendous facial injuries. We managed to get a plane to come from Kenya to take the casualties out to Nairobi. He survived. He didn't survive, he died, but in less pain than if he'd been just out in the bush. The others who went with him did survive and returned treated, but it was horrendous. And I had the privilege of helping to rescue many hundreds of slaves. And on my last visit to the region, when we were there, I was out in an area called Abyei, which is between Sudan and South Sudan, and I heard a young man calling me and saying, "Are you Lady Cox?" And I said, "Well, I think I am, yes." And he said, "I wanted to meet you all my life. You rescued me from slavery." What a privilege. And here he is, lovely young man. And he said, "There are many young people around here who would love to meet you because you rescued them from slavery, and they want to say thank you." What a privilege. And they're lovely people. Well, we move on, I hope. A comprehensive peace agreement was signed in January 2005, brought some peace for South Sudan, a referendum of independence, and the celebration of the new nation of South Sudan on July the 9th, 2011, and David and I were there for those celebrations. But it's not all happy. That jihad war left South Sudan devastated and destitute. Civil wars created new tragedies and massive displacement to this very day. So today it is a time of the glory and the grey. There is independence, but humanitarian crises persist and wars continue. This is up in the north part of South Sudan, in Bahr el-Ghazal, and this is where the displaced people, it's their conditions of life. I mean, that little home, rainy season comes, it will last all of 2 minutes. The conditions are heartbreaking. But they always smile, and I'm always so humbled. Look at that little lady's lovely, lovely smile. This is her hand. You might recognize leprosy. She has very severe leprosy. A great privilege to hold that lady's hand. And in doing so, I'm reminded of these words of St. Francis of Assisi. Pity weeps and turns away. Compassion weeps and puts out a hand to help. What a privilege to be able to do that. Oof. Well, we move now from South Sudan into Sudan, North Sudan, and conditions there are pretty dire too. The former president of Sudan was indicted by the International Criminal Court, the ICC, and he had adopted genocidal policies of ethnic and religious cleansing of Africans and non-Islamist Muslims in they're called the 3 areas: Blue Nile State, Southern Kordofan or the Nuba Mountains, and Darfur. We always, as I said, like to visit. Here we are in one of the villages which has been completely wiped out in part of those genocidal policies. And with Khartoum's constant aerial bombardment of civilians in the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile areas, 500,000 displaced in the Nuba Mountains, and all they could do with constant aerial bombardment, all they could do was climb mountains and hide in caves with deadly snakes. And 250,000 had fled as refugees into already devastated South Sudan. In January 2017, David and I visited civilians forced to flee from their homes in the Nuba Mountains and live in the caves with the deadly snakes. And I'm very grateful to David. It was a rough, tough, steep mountain, And coming down, going up was just hard work. Coming down was very, very dangerous, rocks and everything else. And David came down backward all the time, helping me to stop falling down. So he's a good guy. But it was a tough, tough visit. But these were the conditions they were living in. And these people, you see a cave there, there are interstices through which deadly snakes come. And I remember meeting on that visit a girl who'd survived a deadly snake bite, cobras, but many don't. But these two people said when the bombers come from Khartoum, 50 people will hide, crush into that cave just for protection from the aerial bombardment. Hell on earth. And then in January 2018, we visited Brunei State. We met 9,000. Part of the Christian mandate is to heal the sick, feed the hungry, speak the oppressed, not just the Christian hungry, the Christian oppressed. So we do work with victims of oppression, whatever their faith. And there are many Muslims in this part. And we met 9,000 Muslim internally displaced people who had been forced to flee the fighting at the risk of dying from starvation. And they were suffering pangs of hunger and reduced to eating leaves and plants with no nutritional value. It was heartbreaking. There they are, literally thousands of them. Alleviating pain and hunger. Now, heart is very small. You've got nearly half of heart here. So it may not sound much money, but we did manage to raise £50,000 for them. But when you look at it practically, £25 will feed a family of 7 for 3 months until the rainy season comes. So we were actually able to save many, many lives. And when we went back, they were poignantly grateful. Nigeria is suffering so much. We don't hear much about it. I see Danny's looking at his watch. Am I right for time? All right? He's looking at his watch, rather obviously. Yes. Yes, I'm all right for time. We just got Nigeria and Syria, then time for questions. But Nigeria, we don't hear about this on the news, but the conditions of what are going on in Nigeria are horrific. Islamist terrorist attacks continue in northern and central states, with almost daily reports of killings, rape, abductions, mass forced displacement, and land grabs. The human rights organization Inter-Society, which is responsible, reports that 4,400 Christians were killed within a 9-month period in 2021, in addition to tens of thousands killed in 2009. We work in Middle Belt with local partners there. It's between Abuja, the capital, and Plateau State in the north. And 5,000 Christians were slaughtered there in the first 6 months of last year alone. And thousands of students have been abducted from school, hundreds of churches have been destroyed, entire communities overrun by jihadists. Now, this is the University Church in Jos, but I could sadly show you so many pictures of the destroyed churches. And we will ask survivors if they would tell us what has happened to their families and their communities during the attacks. And here I am, and I only give you a couple of examples. If you read one of our reports, you'll see many, many examples. This lovely lady, she survived an attack, but these are her stories. We heard gunshots. 18 people were killed and their bodies were set alight. They burned homes. No man who couldn't run was killed. A place called Kura that David and I visited. Another one, and this actually from one of the main churches in Jos, the capital of Plateau State. They came around 7 o'clock and left just before midnight. More than 200 in black cloth, well armed. Yesterday we lost another 19 of our people. And in Middle Belt region, where we do our work, thousands of Christians have been massacred, up to 3 million displaced. We never hear about it on the news, do we? No? These include children desperate for education. They can't return to their burnt schools, and it's too dangerous. So when we asked the local people, what's your priority? How can we help? They said, please, 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 will you get education supplies to the children? Because they're desperate for education. The teachers are displaced. They've got teachers, but they've got no education supplies. So what we're doing there, called Roads to Hope, support for mobile education units in Nigeria. We take the education supplies to the displaced communities, and the children and the families are poignantly grateful. Here they are, some of them, with some of the supplies we were able to take, and what a poignant privilege to be able to help them. It is transformational in those dire situations. And we've now taken these to, I think it's about 5,000 children, and many more will be receiving. And we're just moving now to raising money for healthcare vans to take healthcare supplies to the displaced people who also don't have any healthcare. And the Anglican Archbishop of Dross in Plateau State, his wife Gloria, have both suffered persecution and torture. We know them very well. But like all the Nigerians who we meet, they always smile, even in the midst of danger and persecution. It makes me so humble. When they worship, they could be blown up. And there's a famous Catholic church that suffered this, I think, I think it was Pentecost last spring. And this was in southern Nigeria. And they were obviously had a full congregation. And then one of the suicide bombers got into the church and detonated the bomb. And I think about 50 were killed and many were injured. And it goes on all the time. And it can happen anywhere we go. We come across places where churches have been destroyed like that. But when they worship, they could be blown up, but they always worship with such joy. And it makes me very humble. And I say our wonderful friends in Plateau, they've suffered persecution, but they always smile. And that's the wonderful Archbishop Ben, his lovely wife Gloria. They've both been captured, they've both been tortured, but they both smile. But Archbishop Ben's message, I think, is one for all of us. If we have a faith worth living for, it is a faith worth dying for. Don't you, that's us, compromise the faith that we are living and dying for. They are, but they live and they worship with such wonderful spiritual joy. Makes me very humble. And his challenge to us, if you don't resist now, your grandchildren are going to have to fight the battles. You, that's us, did not have the courage to fight. And the fighting is going on now, is escalating in Nigeria. We never hear about it from the British government, and it goes on unabated. So prayers, please, for the people of Nigeria. And the final destination this evening, Syria. I went 3 times between 2016 and 2018. On the road from Damascus up to Aleppo, you just go mile after mile after mile like this, complete devastation and destruction. Heartbreak land. I'm sorry. Malula is a town that's about 40 miles outside Damascus. And we visited there, and it was occupied by Islamist jihadists for 3 months during the war. They perpetrated murders. We stood in a room where 3 men had been slaughtered because they refused to convert from Islam from Christianity. And one was as young as 22. And it makes you feel very humble when you sit in a room where 3 men have been murdered because they refused to give up their Christian faith, one as young as 22. But there were many murders and widespread desecration of Christian holy sites and buildings. This is the town of Malulu. The jihadists occupied it for about 3 months, then they were driven out, and they were just beginning to rebuild, and the first thing they rebuilt was the Madonna, but of course many of the houses are still devastated and destroyed. And every holy building was desecrated. Could show you, and sadly, countless numbers of slides like that, but one must speak for all. But we had wonderful welcome and very good relations. Here we are with the mullahs, the Islamic leaders, with the local church leaders, and with Yazidis, and very welcoming. And here we are worshipping in an Armenian church. There are many Armenians in Syria because they fled from the genocide in 1915, and many of them ended up in Syria. And they now have quite a big Armenian community in Aleppo, the north of Syria. And here we are worshipping in a church. And what's lovely about that church service, the front rows, they were full of the imams. It was very interfaith. The Muslims were there, the Yazidis were there, and the Christians were there. And the choir, lovely, lovely kids, and singing beautifully. I'm afraid some of those have probably been killed since then because the bombs were falling all the time. But an amazing time of worship. And we're helping, we always ask local people, what's your priority? And we say we're working in Malula, that town about 40 miles out of Damascus that had been occupied by the jihadists. And we said, how can we help? And they were collecting and preserving fruit and vegetables to alleviate the food shortages, because there's hardly any food available, and to make some money to enable them to rebuild their homes. Almost all of them are widows, but they're trying to rebuild and restore their lives. And there's a picture of David, if you may recognize him, and myself with two of these lovely ladies, and some of the vegetables and fruits that they're managing to preserve to have food and to make some money to survive. But they still smile. And when we were in Aleppo, while the shelling from the jihadists was still intense, we met a wonderful Chaldean Catholic priest who put into words, in a Christian analogy, the essence of what heart strives to do. And so these words that I'm going to draw to a close. I'm sure you all remember, just remind you, because to put it into context, Thomas, so-called doubting Thomas, wasn't there when Jesus appeared to the other disciples. And he said he wasn't going to believe Jesus had risen from the dead unless Jesus came to him. So Jesus did come, and he said, I'm not going to believe unless I put my hands into his wounded hands and side. So Jesus said, well, put your hand into my wounded hands and side. And that's really, when we visit our wonderful partners, we can't go through the suffering that they're going through, but we can be alongside them. And so his words, a Chaldean Catholic priest in Aleppo, are very, very telling. Thank you for coming. Like St. Thomas the Apostle, who put his hands into Christ's wounded hands and wounded side. This is a powerful phrase. You came to put your hands into the wounds of our suffering. We can't experience their suffering, but we can, like Thomas, put our hands into the wounds of their suffering. Now you have seen our pain. You can believe, go and tell our story. This is what we try to do with heart. And what can we do? All of us, we can pray, desperate. And that's one of the things that always makes me so humble. When with the people suffering so much, you say, what's your priority? Say, prayer. Please pray for us. So pray, but prayer without deeds is dead. So we need to be advocates for peace, justice and freedom, speaking truth to power, including the UK government and international organisations. And we need to promote greater awareness by many churches of the current persecution and encourage their active support for those who are suffering for holding their front lines for our faith and freedom. And this is our motto in Heart. We're tiny, so you've got about 50% of Heart here. We're very small, but our motto is, I cannot do everything, but I must not do nothing. And if we all do something, we can have the privilege of helping our brothers and sisters on those front lines of faith and freedom. So thank you for letting me share the pain and the passion with you. It's been a great privilege, and I'm happy to respond to any questions you may have or comments in the remaining time that we have. So thank you.